materials. And this year we're looking at conditions, composition, climate action, and some other issues. And we're actually launching the next edition of the Fashion Transparency Index tomorrow. I've just been on for the last hour and a half on our press call to launch the index. And we have 220 indicators in this edition. And it covers a really wide range of social and environmental topics, ranging from animal welfare to due diligence, gender equality, recycling, working conditions. And of course, unfortunately, I can't disclose any results until after midnight tonight, but we do find that brands tend to disclose a lot more about their policies than how they put those policies into practice, particularly about the impact they have on the lives of workers and the environment. So, for instance, just to take one example, a couple of years ago, a really big project we worked on was the Garment Worker Diaries, which was the biggest ever survey of garment workers in Bangladesh, India and Cambodia. And we were part of interviews of 540 workers over the course of an entire year. And we found that 60% of the garment workers reported gender-based discrimination, over 15% reported being threatened, and 5% had been hit. So when we look at last year's index, even though slightly more than a third of brands had policies, they supported women's empowerment projects, only 3 brands actually published any data on the prevalence of gender-based violations in supplier facilities. So there's a real gap between what brands say they're doing and say they want to do and what they're disclosing about how that's actually put into practice.
Do you think the importance of transparency has increased due to COVID-19? And how can, kind of talking about what you were just piggybacking off of your last question or statement, can brands be more open about their buying practices?
Yes, I mean, this crisis has proved really exactly why transparency in the fashion industry is so vital. We've seen some brands being transparent with their supplier partners, but most brands have not. And actually in tomorrow's Fashion Transparency Index report, you'll be able to find out a lot more about what brands are disclosing about their purchasing practices and what they're doing to be good business partners to their suppliers. So do brands publish a responsible exit strategy, which disclose the progressive steps they're taking when they stop working with a supplier, rather than just a cut and run approach? How many brands are disclosing the percentage of orders with on-time payments made to suppliers? And how many brands disclose a policy to pay their suppliers within a maximum of 60 days in line with the UK's prompt payment code, for instance? And I think in order to build a more responsible fashion industry, as we eventually come out of the other side of this global crisis, Fashion Revolution is calling upon brands and retailers to disclose much more information about how they work with their suppliers, their purchasing practices, their pricing model. And these purchasing practices have a really direct impact on the ability of factories to pay their workers on time, especially in unprecedented situations such as the ones we find ourselves in now. And payment terms will be really important as the industry starts to recover, because suppliers have absorbed a lot of extra costs during these times, and they may not be able to pre-finance the cost of raw materials and paying for the production of garments as they have done in the past. So if major brands and retailers publish this sort of information, then stakeholders and their customers can start to hold them to account in this sort of situation unfolding now, where brands are just stopping and delaying payments and they're cancelling orders from their suppliers, really with little regard as to how this is going to affect livelihoods of some of the most vulnerable workers across fashion supply chains.
So I've been very vocal, and I agree 100% with you that it's a supply chain, right? And you're only as strong as your weakest link. And what we're seeing right now is the brands and the retailers almost pitted against, I'm sorry, the brands and the retailers and the factories pitted against each other. And that's not the way forward. But obviously the factories are getting a lot of the pain right now. As you mentioned, the cancellations are hitting them, orders that have been shipped Payment's been deferred, new orders that are being placed. There's new payment terms that are being implemented. This is all unilateral. This is not mutually agreed upon. But what would you say for the brands and retailers that argue back and say, we don't have any money, we're furloughing, we're laying off, we have liquidity problems? How should brands and retailers manage this period of time and manage their relationships with the factories right now?
Exactly. I mean, this is really complicated, and a lot of the brands that we've heard about, certainly the big retailers in the UK, some of them who have committed to only pay a small percentage of the costs, are some of the big supermarkets who are not only still open, but their business is booming because they are the only places which are open, but they're jumping on that bandwagon and trying to negotiate as hard as they can. It seems to me that brands have actually learned very little, surprisingly little, since the Rana Plaza factory collapse, which turned into a huge PR disaster for many brands who didn't accept responsibility in a timely manner. And once again, it just feels like many brands and retailers are evading responsibility and its associated costs. And in the social responsibility pages, their websites and their CSR reports, which we've trawled for hundreds of hours for the research for the Fashion Transparency Index, they're referring to these suppliers as partners. But really, when it comes down to the wire, one of these partners is paying the price and the other one's doing a runner. Many of these brands have made billions of dollars in profits every year. And there's really no doubt in my mind that they have the resources, they have those lines of credit, they have the ability, and notwithstanding the moral imperative, to fulfill their obligations to their suppliers. And really, it comes down to a question of priorities, the shareholders or the workers. And it's nothing short of a scandal that people already living in poverty, in low-wage economies and with no safety net, should bear the brunt of brands' unethical and in most cases unlawful behaviour. So what should they do now? Well as honouring their contracts now, brands and retailers need to do so much more to protect some of the most vulnerable workers in the supply chain. For instance, home workers provide really a significant support to the global fashion industry. And that's not just the high street, that's some of the top luxury brands as well. But as most of them aren't in any kind of legally recognised employment, most of them are unable to access any form of support, either from the brands or from the government. And migrant workers were another group who are particularly vulnerable. Not only may they have lost their income, but also potentially their accommodation, or they're in crowded dormitory rooms hundreds of miles away from their families. So brands need to do much more to support the most vulnerable workers at this time, and really to make sure that poverty and hunger don't prove more of a threat to workers than the virus itself. And then beyond the crisis, we really need to see brands and retailers creating models which ring-fence wages and other labour costs in price negotiations. Because when I was in Bangladesh, I was told that brands were paying between 3 and 5% less to the factories every year. And consequently, it's the workers' wages and the workers' rights which are being squeezed. So this is something which really needs to happen. I mean, it's going to be a complex issue. It's going to need collective action. It's going to need transparency. But we have to make sure that the people working in supply chains have fair and decent wages, so they have savings to fall back on in this kind of situation.
Well, I think that deflationary model that you're speaking to also, not to put the consumers on blast, but what role do the consumers play in all of this? Because the reason prices are going down at the factory level is because year after year, the prices at retail are going down. They become more and more promotional. People only want to shop when there's a sale. So we're seeing cost of goods go up. We're seeing in many countries the minimum wage of labor go up. Raw materials obviously are depressed right now due to demand, but they have gone up. All costs have gone up. Cost of sustainability has gone up. Cost at retail has gone down, which has created a huge margin compression. And so, what role do consumers play in this role of transparency?
Yes, you're right. I mean, I completely agree that we do all need to start paying a little more for our clothing. But at the same time, the labour costs are such a small percentage, often between 1% and 3% of the cost, the retail cost of a garment. And it's been estimated that putting as little as 25 pence onto the cost of an item of clothing made in Bangladesh would guarantee a fair wage for the workers. I know in our first fanzine, Money, Fashion, Power, we did an estimate of a €30 t-shirt, which isn't the cheapest t-shirt. And it was about €1.38 onto the retail price to actually pay a fair wage to the workers, including all of the markups through the supply chain. So I think, everybody does need to start paying a little bit more money to guarantee those living wages. But also consumers need to be using their voices and their power to hold brands and retailers to account, to ask who made my clothes. So at the moment we have an email form on the homepage for our website. We've heard from brands and retailers that actually petitions aren't very effective. They don't think it's their customers who sign this sort of thing. What's really important to them is getting emails from their customers. So we have a pre-populated email tool, which thousands of people have signed already. And you can just put the brand's name in and it will automatically send an email to the brands that you shop from to ask them what they're doing. Are they going to guarantee to pay for their contracts and to pressurize the brands to do more in this kind of situation. And this sort of nuanced messaging is really important to try to get brands to move in the right direction. So asking who made my clothes just lets them know that their customers care and they expect better in this kind of situation.
I know it sounds crazy to think that a quarter could make such a difference for the livelihoods of people around the world, but I can tell you my experience. I have lost orders in the past over 2 cents, 3 cents, 5 cents. I used to joke that I have to negotiate in rupees in order to get an order done, and that's how really it's coming down to pennies at the end of the day, and it's horrible. And having said that, you said something before about the partnership, and this has become almost a mockery if you think of it, because we're seeing that it's not really a partnership at all. I was talking to a factory last week, and he says, Eddie, when I'm 2 or 3 days late, I air the goods. That's my expense. If there's the slightest quality issue, if the sticker's on the wrong side of the box, I have a chargeback. Anything, that happens, I have to pay for. But here, where there's a little bit of pain on the other side, I can't hold anyone accountable. So it's a one-sided relationship. So do you think, because it's almost impossible right now for the relationship to be managed on its own, does the government have to intervene at all? Or do you think this could be solved between the brands and the retailers and the factories themselves?
Yes, I mean, it takes a long time to bring about policy change. So I think in this instance, yes, we do need to rely on the governments in countries like India, Bangladesh to step in. But at the moment, that safety net is often only available, as I was saying, to those workers who are formally employed in the factories, and it doesn't cover the subcontractors, the home workers, so many people who are working, the girls under 16 who are part of the Sumangali system, who aren't on the books of the ginning mills and places like that. But generally, regulation is certainly key to getting the laggards to move. And legally required due diligence and reporting is already starting to happen in several countries. It came in France in 2019 with their Loi de Vigilance. And when we do our Fashion Transparency Index research, we find that a lot of the brands, particularly those who aren't disclosing much information at all, are only disclosing in their modern slavery statements and their California supply chain statements. So we really do believe that governments can have a really important role to play in order to push those laggard brands to move. And really, in an age of climate breakdown, voluntary measures and intangible support which lack legislation just aren't going to save us.
So you and I have had several conversations about Expedition Voyage, but for those that are not familiar with this, or you're even wondering, what does that even have to do with fashion? Can you just tell the audience, a little bit about this?
Yes, I've just come back last month from a really exciting voyage. I sailed over 2,000 nautical miles from the Galapagos to Easter Island into the South Pacific Gyre, which is one of the areas of accumulation of microplastics in the world, as part of a multidisciplinary, all-female crew. It's part of a 2-year, it's actually become a 3-year now, round-the-world voyage, and it will gather the first ever global data set of microplastic pollution and toxics in the ocean. And this is really important for brands and retailers because we will analyse what types of polymers there are. And those brands who really are committed to reducing microfibres and microplastics will be better able to understand the density, the distribution in the oceans, so they can then prioritise actions to reduce those areas of greatest impact. And we'll also be looking at the chemicals which are in and on the clothing. These are often chemicals which will leach out of the clothing, and they can affect our health and our fertility. And for Fashion Revolution Week, which starts today, we have a new Fashion Revolution hashtag which has been launched, What's in My Clothes? And by introducing this new campaign collection, this new campaign question, we're hoping to shed light on those hidden substances within our clothing. And I was really shocked when I looked at last year's Fashion Transparency Index that only a third of brands are disclosing their restricted substances list. So this is disclosing the chemicals which are or aren't allowed into our clothing. And it's also surprising that just 19% of brands are reporting on any kind of progress towards eliminating the use of hazardous chemicals. So in this year's index, which is going to be launched tomorrow, we're also looking at what brands are doing in terms of microfibres. So are they investing in any kind of innovation, testing? Are they part of any microfibre task force, for example? So that's another new question on this year's index.
So I have just one last question because we're running out of time and I want to go to Q&A. But Jordana mentioned this, you just brought it up, Fashion Revolution Week. Can you just tell us what this is? You said it started today. Just give us a little bit of a background on this.
Yes, I mean, this is the 7th year the 6th year we've run Fashion Revolution Week. It's 7 years since the Rana Plaza factory collapse. And we have a week of activities taking place all around the world. And we have so many things happening this week. We have Fashion Open Studio, which is the first international fashion showcase to have produced an entirely digital schedule. So if you look for Fashion Open Studio, there's actually a separate website with information about all of the events. You can go inside of the studios and have conversations with some of the world's top designers, sustainable designers, and there's hundreds of events taking place. We have Fashion Question Time, which normally takes place in the past in the Houses of Parliament in the UK. Last year it was at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and this will take place online as well, tackling the theme mass consumption, the end of an era, a theme which was selected several months ago, and couldn't feel more appropriate at this time. And as in all previous years, we want people to start asking those questions to brands and retailers. Who made my clothes? What's in my clothes? And we want designers, producers, community groups, artisans, factory workers, factories to show us photographs of all of the people in our supply chain using the hashtag #IMadeYourClothes.
So, Carrie, why don't we hop right into some Q&A? I see a bunch of questions popping up now. Here's an audience question to Carrie. I am a student going into sustainability studies. Do you think this is an appropriate time to request an internship in the field?
Yes, I mean, I think it's hard right at the moment, obviously, because we don't know when brands and retailers are going to be reopening. We don't know when designers are going to be back at work again. So, obviously not right at this moment. But I think it's really hard to know what brands' priorities are going to be as we come out of this global crisis as well. I mean, we have heard that almost everybody in some of the sustainability departments have been laid off. I mean, I'm guessing they're some of the first workers and they're seen as being of the least priority. And it's quite shocking at how many brands have furloughed nearly everybody in their departments. So I think it's a really good time to going into this field because we do need revolutionary change. We have to have revolutionary change, and we have to make sure that actually this crisis that we work together, because this change isn't going to happen on its own. These brands are going to be coming out of the other side of this crisis with huge quantities of stock, with dents to their profits, and they're going to be wanting to sell harder and faster faster than they ever have done before. So we have to make sure sustainability is on their agenda. So certainly to my mind, it's a really appropriate time to be going into this field.
All right, let's take another question. Did you ever try to get influencers involved in your campaigns to mobilize the consumers and hence the retailers?
Yes, we did in the first year. We had an amazing photo shoot with Trevor Layton, who's one of the world's top portrait photographers, and we had quite a raft of different influencers, from members of parliament to Olympians to television presenters. And we've had different influencers involved. And then the last few years, we've very deliberately stepped back from using influencers, which is probably a good thing at the present time, because I think, we've seen quite a backlash against influencers. And we've seen that the people who are important in this pandemic are the people like the garment workers, the people making the masks. We've got new heroes these days, and that's really great. That's why we want to celebrate them. And I've been so excited to see over the last few days some of these big brands actually celebrating the people who are making the personal protective equipment. So Gildan, for example, which is a huge global brand, is putting photographs of workers online every day in their factories all around the world making the PPE, and they all have posters saying, "I made your mask." So these are the kind of people that we want to be celebrating. These are the heroes at the moment.
All right, so last question. Actually, this one I think is for me. Another question to you, Edward. How do you feel communication is changing as far as news and press? Is this part of the industry that is growing due to people wanting solid and real information? I guess how I would answer that is, I feel a commitment, although it's very hard at times to report some of this news. As we mentioned, some of my customers, some of my paying customers, to put them on blast, exposing some of their practices, is a very difficult thing to do, because you're trying to think about the commercial aspect of your business, but you have to think about what information does the industry need? How can you give vital information to the factories? Also, if a retailer is struggling and the factor community is not supporting them, you want to make that information available so that wholesalers know maybe it's a risk, maybe factories know it's a risk. I think also, this is not a time for fluff. This is a time for real. Like last night we broke. I had a writer at 10 o'clock at night writing about how duty could be. This is crucial information that, in the history of sourcing, I've never seen so many people on the site, because this is information that's going to make or break someone's business. If they could defer something for, 90 days, that helps it with liquidity. So yes, I think that I used to say sourcing is the new black. It used to not be sexy. Now we're realizing that supply chain logistics, sustainability, all this is vital to one's success. Anyway, I know we're out of time. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for everything that you do for the industry. And thank you to Fashinnovation for having us. All right, and we're out.